Hey everyone, Mr. Denton here. Going to take you guys through the first part of this Prezi that is going to show us the road to World War II. And I'm going to try and keep this down around 20 minutes or so. A lot of information here, so I'm going to have to move pretty fast though. Okay, do the best that I can. We're going to pick up kind of where World War One ends, and today we're going to look at the rise of the dictators. And so a lot of fascinating characters in World War II. It's one of the reasons why people are so interested in it. Some of them are not great people, obviously, but it does make for, like I said, some interesting study and conversation. One of the things that you need to understand about this is we're going to move through this looking at things mostly from the point of view of the United States. That doesn't mean that everything is all about the United States. In fact, much of World War II was not about us, but this is U.S. history, so that's how we're gonna look at things, and it's important for us to understand how we were reacting to things as they were happening. Okay, so we'll start by looking at Germany at the end of World War One and what they were dealing with. They were blamed for everything. Okay, they had total responsibility. This stuff should seem familiar to you because we spent a lot of time talking about the fact that things were mismanaged so badly at the end of World War One, and so much blame was put on Germany, and countries didn't learn any lessons from what had taken place in that war. Okay, Germany was in a really bad situation, and they were basically from the end of World War One at 1918 all the way up to the Great Depression. And the thing is, when the Great Depression hit, it hit everybody, us included, and things got really bad here, but we didn't get anywhere close to where Germany was at. Like I said, they were already in bad shape, and then the Great Depression hit, and they just absolutely hit rock bottom. Okay? And so because everybody else was suffering, they didn't let up on Germany. Germany owed everyone money because of the reparations that they had to pay as a result of the treaty at the end of World War One, and nobody let up because they were suffering too. Germany had a democracy actually that was put in place after the First War called the Weimar Republic, but it didn't take very long for people to get to where they just didn't trust them, because that's what happens when life gets really bad. People don't trust the people in charge. And they looked at things and said, hey, these guys aren't making our lives any better. They're not getting things fixed. And so they started to look for other answers. You're going to notice a pretty common theme when we talk about our response. And when I say our, I'm talking about the United States. The United States, leading up to World War One, in some ways was an isolationist country. And so we had some things. We were trying to reach out into the world, but for the most part, Americans didn't want to get involved in World War One until we did. And then when it happened, even just being in that war for 1 year, Americans in general were sick of it before it ended. And so we were doing everything to keep ourselves out of any kind of conflicts and stay away from other people's problems. We didn't join the League of Nations after World War One, and when people owed us money, we didn't let up on them either. Instead, what we tried to do was we tried to loan them more money to get their economy going so that they could pay all of it back to us, and that typically just made the problem worse. Okay, so on to Hitler. Hitler was born in Austria in 1889. And he, had a string of failures as a young man, most notably as an artist. But he found himself in the military. He joined at the beginning of World War One, and he came out on the other side of that war as an extreme nationalist, someone who very passionately believed in his country, thought that Germany should have won the war, that they shouldn't have given up, and that this new democracy that sprouted up in Germany betrayed the German people by signing that peace treaty that was a horrible thing for them. So the Nazis were actually a party that existed before Hitler, but when he joined and he became a more popular figure with a lot of his ideas, Hitler and his ideas became fused with the Nazi party. It was actually in the beginning a party that was supposed to be there to represent workers, and that was it. They were there to represent the working man, but then they eventually became synonymous with the swastika, with Hitler, with the anti-Jewish sentiments that he brought along. He joined the party in 1921 and tried to actually lead a revolution called the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923. And it was a huge failure. He got thrown in prison for a year, and that's where he wrote a book called Mein Kampf. Some of you guys may have heard of it or maybe even read it. It's actually been outlawed in Germany just until I think it was 2015. And in this book, he outlines, and Mr. Wheeler would correct me if he heard me say this, it wasn't actually meant to be a book. It was kind of meant to be like a speech that he dictated and spoke, and it was recorded. So regardless, it was full of Hitler's ideas, his political plans, this idea about an Aryan race where there's a superhuman race that lived within the German population, blonde hair, blue eyes. And yes, Hitler had dark hair, dark eyes. He was a controversial and just a conflicted person in a lot of ways, and that was one of them. And he believed that Germany, the only way that it could survive and thrive was to grow and to take over more territory because, the German people, that's what they needed. They needed more resources, and they deserved to be at the top of the heap. Okay. Also got to talk about the root of their problems. Most of you guys know where I'm going with that. The Jewish people. He saw them as a disease and one that needed to be rooted out and gotten rid of if Germany was going to be what it was capable of being. Okay. So, quick rundown on his rise to power here. As the Nazis grew in size and popularity, Hitler becomes their most prominent figure. Okay, and you see the timeline there, late 20s, early 30s. In 1932, as the Nazis and Hitler become more powerful, they eventually become the largest party in the Reichstag, which was basically the German form of Congress. Okay, and here again, Germany's still technically a democracy, but Hitler used the weakness of this democracy to rise to power, and then as he gains more power, he takes more power for himself, and people kind of let him do it because they just had become so desperate with the way things were in Germany. They were looking for someone to believe in, and they were looking for someone to blame their problems on, and Hitler gave them the answer to both those questions. Believe in me, blame your problems on the Jewish people. So eventually what he does is he stages a fire. It's a pretty well-known fact, that he stages a fire, burns the Reichstag down, and suspends it. And so now all the power that was supposed to exist in Germany's Congress or Parliament or whatever you want to call it now resides in him. He's the leader of that body, and now he is the body. And so then in 1934, the German president dies, and Hitler takes that office as well and just combines all of it together and declares himself the Fuhrer. That's a name you may have heard of before. So in other words, he is the absolute ruler. He is the law. What he says is the law, etc. So he takes control of the entire government, outlaws anybody speaking out against him or being against him politically. The government starts to censor all kinds of information and news and things of that nature, textbooks, all that kind of stuff under him. And it's basically, Germany is gone. It's Hitler now. Hitler is Germany. And that's they're one and the same. So along with all this comes the anti-Semitism, which basically means prejudice or hostility towards Jewish people. Okay. In the beginning, they were expelled from government positions and teaching positions. They were not allowed to practice law or medicine. And then in 1935, another step is taken where their citizenship is gone now. They can't intermarry with non-Jewish people. They had to register with the government and wear that yellow star you see over there or some form of it on their clothing so that they were marked. And you can imagine what kinds of implications there were for that. And so it really it starts to bring up this idea that the Jewish people were a race, even though being Jewish that's a faith. That's a choice that people make to believe or not to believe. But now it's turned into a deal where the Jewish people, they are Jewish because of their DNA, because of the blood that's in their veins, not because of any choices or beliefs that they have. And so you don't have a choice whether or not you're Jewish. It's all depending on who your family is, what your grandparents were, and so on and so forth. And so a lot of Jews at this point leave when they see the handwriting on the wall, and they get out and they try to go to other places, and they're scattered all over the place. Some of them even try to come to the United States, and we actually turn some of them away because the racism against the Jewish people was not just a German problem. It belonged to everyone, and the United States was included in that. Then in 35, you had Kristallnacht as well, the Night of the Broken Glass, where this is the beginning of just open violence against the Jewish people. 7,500 Jewish-owned stores were broken into and looted. 200 synagogues were destroyed. 100 people were killed. 30,000 more were arrested and interned. And this is the beginning of Jewish people basically, being physically removed and abused and everything else. We're not to the Holocaust yet, but we're not far off. How does the United States respond to this? We were too worried about our own problems, and we had a Great Depression going on. And because we were dealing with all that stuff, we weren't investing in our military. At that time, we had the 15th largest army in the world. It's hard to imagine today. The United States if we spend more on our military than the next 8 countries combined. So this is hard for us to imagine. So our number one goal here of our president and of our government was to try and convince Hitler and everybody else in Europe to keep their cool, not go crazy, and don't go to war. And our Congress even tried to pass laws that outlawed war. Okay, but that's not really a realistic possibility in any time. Okay. So there's Hitler. There's some other characters we need to talk about. One of them is Mussolini, who was the guy that rose to power in Italy in the same kinds of circumstances. Italy was struggling. Italy got left out of the peace process for the most part at the end of World War I. And this is why that treaty was such a big failure, is because it didn't include a lot of people, and those countries felt slighted. Their leaders felt slighted, and so then they tried to make a name for themselves and bring their country back to prominence through violence. And so this is where we are. Mussolini preached a lot of the same kinds of things that Hitler did. In fact, Hitler stole a lot of things from Mussolini's playbook. Nationalism, militarism, nostalgia for the old glory days of ancient Rome. And so in 1922, he seizes power. Unlike Hitler, who kind of rose up through a democracy, Mussolini just came in and took the power, and people mostly let him have it. 1935, Italy invades Ethiopia, a country in northern Africa. Not a huge significant thing on the world stage, but it's one of the first episodes of outright violence by one of these countries. And the important thing with that is that everybody kind of stood by and did nothing. Okay, so you see that in this slide here. It's the same stuff again over and over again with the United States. It just continues to progress. Okay, Italy is invading northern Africa, and America basically turns its head the other way. We've got too many problems. Nobody wants to send American boys to die for someone else's problems. And so we are passing, as this is going on, these neutrality acts. Remember what neutrality means: that you see a fight break out, you don't jump in and try to break it up. You don't, try to pick one side or the other. You just stand on the sidelines and watch. And that's basically what our people wanted to do. Okay. So these acts said not only did we have to stay out of war, but we couldn't sell weapons to countries that were at war. We couldn't travel on ships that belonged to countries at war. If you remember back to World War I, that's one of the things that dragged us in. Americans riding on the Lusitania, which got sunk. It was a British ship, but Americans died. And then no loans to countries that were at war either. So Franklin Roosevelt summed it all up and asked our businesses to not sell goods to help these people out, okay, and to just try to stay as neutral as we possibly could. But remember, it's the Great Depression. People have to sell things and they have to make money, and ultimately putting food on the table was more important to a lot of these people than worrying about what was going on the other side of the world. The Spanish Civil War, I typically don't dig into this too much, but what it is, it's kind of a testing ground in some ways, both for weapons and also for politics, I guess you might say. You've got a nationalist party. There's a civil war in Spain, and one side is nationalists, kind of buying into the same stuff, very Hitler-esque, and then you've got a more democratic, Republican type side as well. Hitler sends in German weapons and Italian weapons, and really what Hitler and Mussolini are trying to do is they're trying to see if anybody else is going to stand up to him, if anybody else is going to step in and do anything. And the answer to that is no. Okay. The bad guys, the aggressive guys, are willing to be bullies, and the good guys don't want to stand up to them because they're too worried about what's going to happen if they do. They don't want another war. And Hitler and Mussolini know this. And often you hear the bully analogy made about this, and it's a good one. If you run into a bully and he tries to take your lunch money and you just give it to him, what's the bully going to do? He's going to come back again tomorrow, and he's probably going to ask for more. And that's what these guys do, because bullies get more bold the more they realize that nobody's going to stand up to them. So Roosevelt was starting to get pulled in multiple directions. Some people thought he already wasn't being neutral enough. Some people thought that he needed to do more. But ultimately, he took no action because he knew the American people were not going to get behind him if he did. So we stayed out of it, didn't do anything. Okay. Lastly, we'll talk about Japan. So Japan, again, was devastated by the Great Depression. They were left out at the end of World War One. Should sound like a broken record to you at this point. And they had this extreme code of honor, kind of dating back to sort of like the samurai and lots of other things along those lines. And so this just violated that honor code that they had, that they thought they were being slighted and being treated as a second-rate nation. And so in the midst of all this, their military leaders kind of took over the country, rose to power, started to build up the military and prepare to go to war and conquer, because they thought that's what they were meant to do. And they started to do a lot of the same things. So you don't have that one individual like you had, with Hitler or Mussolini, but you had a group that basically were doing the same thing. And they censored, information. They arrested critics. They got rid of professors in their schools that were speaking out against them. Secret police and propaganda were a big time thing, just like they were in the other places, Italy and Germany, that we've already talked about. They're going to sell you a bunch of stuff about how things are supposed to be, and if you don't buy into it, you're probably going to disappear in the middle of the night. And that's the way things are. That's why you don't want to live in a tyrannical fascist state. Sometimes we get frustrated with how slowly things move here in America, but because things move so slow, we don't have to deal with stuff like that. We're free to speak and to do as we want, and we're not going to disappear in the middle of the night if we do. Okay. So the Japanese saw themselves as this big empire, even though they were a tiny island nation, but there were 65 million people there, and they thought we need to continue to expand. And the first place they looked was in China. And so a lot of people see the beginning of World War II as, 1941 with Pearl Harbor for us, or, 40 with Poland. But many look at 1931 as actually the beginning, all the way back at the beginning of the 30s when the Japanese attacked northeastern China, Manchuria. So in 1940, you have the Tripartite Pact, which brings together the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Okay. More of the same here for the United States. Okay. You can read the information there, but it's really more of the same. And obviously I'm skimming over the top here, but we continue to speak out against these things somewhat, but not really do anything about it. And the thing is with Japan, they saw us as a threat, and we, eventually started to push back a little bit, and we started to cut off ties with them. because of some of the things that they were doing. And the Japanese, they saw us as a threat because we were a presence in the Pacific, and they needed us out of the way because Japan was small. They needed resources. They needed rubber for tires. They needed oil to fuel their planes and everything else. And we stood in the way of those things. And when they started to puff their chests up against us, we kind of, we didn't get overly aggressive, but we spoke out against it and we pushed back a little bit. And some people, some Americans thought we were asking for war a little bit. But ultimately, Roosevelt recognized that, we were going to eventually have to go to war if things continued on the path they were on. He was trying to prevent that as much as he possibly could, but his hands were tied. A lot of it was out of his control, and he knew that the American people were not going to back him on this. He was going to have to try and take as many steps as he could without overstepping his bounds, but he was going to have to wait on the American people to catch up with him, and they just weren't there yet. Okay, so I believe that brings us to the end of part 1 and gets us ready for part 2, which we will post separately from this video. Okay, so that will be out soon. Keep your eyes peeled. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you soon.